Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here.
So today we're looking at really the ultimate clash, like absolute divine authority versus total human autonomy. For centuries, this unquestioned belief in an all-powerful God was, well, it was the cultural anchor for human civilization.
Right, the absolute bedrock.
Exactly. And then came the wrecking ball of atheism, which just tore those ancient structures down.
Right.
But, and this is where it gets absolutely crazy, instead of just walking away from religion entirely, there's this fascinating new wave of post-atheistic non-believers.
Yeah, it's wild.
Right. They are literally reclaiming the ultimate symbol of cosmic rebellion, Satan, to find meaning and ritual and community in what they see as a completely godless universe.
It's such a massive paradigm shift, and we have a genuinely compelling stack of sources on the table today to help us, unpack this. Primarily, we're looking at this raw, unedited transcript from a recent panel debate between devout Christians and modern Satanists.
Which gets pretty intense, I have to say.
Oh, very intense. And we've layered that with a comprehensive historical breakdown of how different cultures and philosophies and, well, religions have conceptualized the devil over millennia.
Yeah.
So our mission for you listening today is to put these intensely contrasting worldviews under the microscope. We're going to examine how humans define morality, how they define true freedom, and really where they derive their life's purpose, whether they're looking up to a supreme cosmic creator or, looking entirely inward to the self.
Yeah, and before we really get into the weeds here, I need to offer a quick but very important disclaimer for you. We are going to explore some highly charged religious and anti-religious viewpoints today.
Very charged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we take absolutely no sides on this show. Our goal is purely to act as your guides, to unpack the ideas and the underlying philosophies and just the raw human experiences presented in the source material. Oh, and real quick, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Always appreciate that.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to understand this cultural shift, we have to establish a baseline. What actually happens to a society's moral framework when you just unplug it from the concept of a supreme God?
Well, to understand the unplugging, you first have to understand the socket. Right?
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So in the traditional theistic worldview, which is argued, very passionately by the Christian panelists in our debate sources, God is the unchanging, objective standard of morality.
Right.
In this framework, God doesn't just, possess a list of good morals. His very nature is the definition of good.
It's the anchor.
Exactly. And the philosophical argument they present is that without this ultimate cosmic anchor, morality instantly loses its objective weight. It descends into subjectivity. One panelist made a really brilliant point, actually.
The pizza one, right?
Yes. They said that without an ultimate judge, morality is just a personal preference. Like, disliking murder becomes philosophically no different than disliking a specific topping on a pizza. Yeah, it's just your biological or cultural preference against mine.
Right, because if the universe is just a cosmic accident of atoms bumping into each other, there's no fundamental law of physics that says, thou shalt not steal.
Exactly. And that brings us directly to the secular and atheist concepts detailed in the sources. So, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche?
Yeah, the God is dead guy.
Right. He famously declared that God is dead. Now, he didn't mean like a literal bearded man in the clouds had physically died.
Sure.
He was making a sociological observation that in the wake of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, traditional religious morals had permanently lost their cultural authority to unite society.
They just didn't hold weight anymore.
Right. Fast forward a bit to the philosopher Albert Camus. He took this a step further, arguing that life is fundamentally absurd.
Absurd? Like how?
Well, because humans are desperate for inherent meaning, but the universe responds with absolute freezing silence.
Jeez, that's bleak.
It is. And for Camus, evil isn't a cosmic dark force. It's entirely a human construct.
Okay, but I have to jump in here with the specific pushback that came up in the debate sources, because this is where the philosophy actually hits the pavement.
Go for it.
If morality doesn't come from a divine book handed down from a mountain, where do atheists get it from?
Right, the source in question.
Exactly. One of the non-theistic panelists argued that they derived their entire sense of right and wrong from reading, thousands of secular books as a kid.
Oh, the sci-fi stuff.
Yeah. They specifically pointed to science fiction and fantasy authors. Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Robert Jordan.
Classic world builders.
Totally. And they argued that pairing those diverse narratives with natural human empathy creates a really robust moral compass. But I kept thinking while reading this, is empathy really enough of a guardrail when human nature inevitably goes dark?
That's the million-dollar question. And the debate sources show that empathy often crumbles under pressure, which points to a really fascinating evolution in the atheist movement itself, which one of the non-theistic panelists actually articulated perfectly.
What did they say?
They described the new wave of atheism in the 1990s and early 2000s as a giant hammer.
A hammer. Okay.
Yeah. It swung in and aggressively smashed old religious systems, declaring them, illogical, unscientific, obsolete.
Right.
The problem, a hammer is a tool for demolition, not construction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it successfully broke the old systems, but it didn't replace them with anything. It just left a massive existential void for an entire generation of secular people.
So it's like you've used the hammer, you've completely smashed the stained glass windows, now you're standing in the rubble and it's freezing cold.
Exactly. What do you build to stay warm?
Right. Because human beings are wired for stories. We're wired for community, for a shared rhythm of life. You can't just shove people into a purely logical, sterile room and expect them to thrive.
You really can't.
And that leads us to the phenomenon described in the sources as post-atheism.
Yeah, because nature abhors a vacuum. Into this specific cultural void stepped modern, non-theistic Satanists.
Which is such a wild pivot.
It really is. We are talking about groups like the Satanic Temple or LaVeyan Satanists. And to be absolutely clear, we need to define our terms here based on the sources. These people do not believe in a literal God, and they certainly do not believe in a literal, supernatural red monster living underground.
Right. No pitchforks.
No pitchforks. The term LaVeyan, for example, refers to Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan in the 1960s, using Satan strictly as a theatrical, atheistic metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
For carnal pride and liberty.
Okay, so they are adopting an adversarial label purely for the shock value. I actually have an analogy for this.
Let's hear it.
It feels like tearing down an apartment building because you absolutely despise the landlord. But then you realize you still need a roof over your head to survive the winter.
Right.
So you build a new house, but you use the old landlord's most hated taboo symbols as your wallpaper just to spite him.
That's quite the visual.
But, I mean, why not just call yourself a secular humanist? Why take on the baggage of the word Satan?
Well, the analogy is fun, but it actually breaks down a bit when you look closely at human psychology. It's not just about spiting the landlord with edgy wallpaper.
Okay, then what is it?
It's the realization that the underlying architecture of rebellion and myth is psychologically vital for human beings. We fundamentally need ritual to process our existence.
Like we need the drama of it.
Exactly. The sources point out how romantic poets, like William Blake, reinterpreted old religious symbols after the French Revolution to make sense of a world that was just turning upside down.
Oh, interesting.
Or consider John Milton's 17th century epic poem, Paradise Lost.
Right, classic.
Milton set out to justify the ways of God to men, but he inadvertently wrote Satan as this deeply charismatic, tragic rebel defying an absolute monarch.
He accidentally made him the cool guy.
Pretty much. And modern post-atheists are adopting these powerful, emotionally resonant literary symbols because secular humanism, well, while it's logical, it often lacks poetry and fire.
It's too dry.
Yeah, it lacks the mythic glue that binds a community together.
And they definitely have community. Like, they aren't just reading science textbooks in a sterile lab.
No, not at all.
The sources detail how these modern satanic groups hold high Sabbaths on days like Halloween. They organize community charity work. They have established tenets, which kind of act as their version of pillars or commandments to correct wrongs and seek justice.
But notice how those tenets function compared to religious commandments.
What do you mean?
Well, if a Christian breaks a commandment, the mechanism for resolution is confession and seeking divine absolution from God. The slate is wiped clean externally.
Right, you get forgiven by a higher power.
Exactly. But for the non-theistic Satanist, if they violate one of their own tenets, there's no God to forgive them. The mechanism is entirely internal and practical.
So how do they handle it?
The sources explain that they focus on immediate restitution. You harm someone, you make it right with that specific person, and you carry the memory of that failure as a tool for personal growth. They want the moral framework and the trappings of a religion, but they completely reject the submission to an external deity.
So it's entirely about the internal struggle rather than the external ruler.
Exactly.
And the sources point out this isn't entirely new. Take the Buddhist concept of Mara.
Oh, yeah, that's a great connection.
Yeah. Mara isn't a demon with a pitchfork trying to steal your soul. Mara is a celestial embodiment of illusion, ego, and desire. It represents the internal psychological forces that distract humans from achieving enlightenment.
Which perfectly sets up the core clash of this entire deep dive.
Ah, sorry.
Because whether you view the devil as an internal illusion or an external rebel, this clash of symbols ultimately boils down to one foundational question. What is true freedom?
That's heavy.
Is it living completely without constraints, or is it living within a perfect designed framework?
Well, let's break down the Christian definition of freedom first.
Yeah.
In their worldview, freedom is not just do what thou wilt.
Right, it's not a free-for-all.
Because if freedom is just doing whatever you want, whenever you want, driven entirely by your base desires, the Christian panelists argue that ultimately leads to chaos, anxiety, and a complete loss of control, what they term the bondage of sin.
Yeah.
True freedom in this framework is actually found in submission to God's design. Think of it like the underlying physics engine of a complex video game.
I like this analogy.
Yeah, it's not a tyrant making arbitrary rules to ruin your fun. It's the developer saying, hey, if you try to glitch through this wall, your save file will corrupt, because that's simply how the code of reality is written.
That is a very apt way to describe the theistic view of boundaries. But then we pivot to the atheist and Satanist definition of freedom, which is often referred to in esoteric literature as the left-hand path.
Okay, define that jargon for us.
Simply put, the right-hand path historically refers to orthodoxy, following community rules, and submitting to a higher power. The left-hand path is about breaking cultural taboos, questioning authority, and ultimately self-deification. In this view, freedom is the absolute right to experience life, to make your own choices, and crucially, to carry the absolute unmitigated responsibility for your actions.
So you're entirely on the hook.
Entirely. There is no cosmic scapegoat. You cannot blame the devil when you act maliciously, and you cannot attribute your kindness to the Holy Spirit. You own your actions completely.
I want to pause here because the debate sources took a profoundly heavy turn when discussing this total freedom.
They really did.
Because if you have total autonomy, you also have the freedom to inflict unspeakable horrors on other people. This brings up the problem of pain. And I was genuinely struck by how raw the non-theistic panelists were.
It was hard to read in places.
Yeah. One panelist worked in an intensive care unit during 2020 and witnessed gruesome, agonizing deaths day in and day out. Another panelist shared that his own son was violently murdered.
Just heartbreaking.
Unimaginable. And for them, looking at that level of suffering proves that the universe is just cold, mechanical, and totally indifferent. They essentially asked the Christians, how can you sit there and claim there is an all-loving, all-powerful God watching my son die and doing absolutely nothing?
Yeah, philosophy feels incredibly hollow when you're standing in an ICU or a cemetery. The pain those panelists expressed is visceral, and the Christian panelists in the transcript acknowledge the immense weight of that grief before offering their theological framework.
Right. What was their response?
Well, impartially outlining the Christian response from the text. The argument is that God values human free will to such an extreme, terrifying degree that he allows humanity the choice to do evil.
Because without choice, it's just programming.
Exactly. The logic is that without the actual ability to choose evil, love and goodness wouldn't be choices at all. We would just be programmed robots running a script.
But what about the suffering itself?
The Christian panelists emphasized that their God doesn't just watch the horror from a comfortable distance. They pointed out that in Christian theology, God literally entered the physical world and was also unjustly tortured and murdered.
So sharing in the pain.
Yes. They don't offer a mathematical equation to solve suffering. Rather, they hold on to the promise of ultimate justice and redemption, where every broken thing will eventually be restored.
So what does this all mean when the clock runs out?
Ah, the end game.
Yeah. If we're completely free to choose between submitting to a divine creator or embracing total, absolute autonomy, how do these worldviews handle the ultimate consequence at the end of a human life?
Well, this brings us to the concept of hell. And the sources provide a fascinating look at how this concept has evolved over time. From the atheistic or Satanist view, hell simply isn't real.
Right.
It's either viewed as a poetic symbol for the suffering we experience right here on Earth, or it's dismissed as a medieval literary invention, heavily popularized by works like Dante's Inferno rather than ancient texts.
Just a story to keep people in line.
Basically. The sources also dive into ancient Jewish concepts to show the evolution of the devil figure. In early texts, the term ha-Satan wasn't a name.
It wasn't.
No, it was a title meaning the adversary or the accuser. Think of a prosecuting attorney in the divine court, meant to test human faith, like in the book of Job. It was definitely not a horned ruler of a fiery subterranean underworld.
But for the Christians in the panel, hell is a very literal reality, heavily spoken of by Jesus in the New Testament texts.
True, but the sources provide a much more nuanced Christian view on this that goes far beyond the cartoon pitchforks and fire. One panelist broke down the original language.
Oh, right, the Greek and Hebrew stuff.
Yeah, they pointed out Hebrew words like Sheol, which is best understood as the grave, or a shadowy waiting place for the dead. Then there's the concept of Gehenna, a literal burning garbage dump outside Jerusalem that Jesus uses as a metaphor for the ultimate destruction of everything toxic and evil. The theological argument presented in the debate is that hell isn't God actively torturing people for eternity. Rather, hell is the ultimate respect for human choice.
How does that work?
Well, if God is the source of all life, joy, and goodness, and a human being uses their free will to say, I want absolutely nothing to do with you, God ultimately honors that choice by locking the door from the inside. He separates himself from them. He won't force you into his presence.
Which flips the coin right back to the secular side. If there is no God and there is no hell, then you are the ultimate master of yourself. You are the highest authority in your universe.
Yeah, total autonomy.
And I want to pose this philosophical question to you listening. If you worship yourself, as one panelist boldly claimed to do, doesn't that get incredibly tiring?
The burden of the self is arguably the heaviest weight a modern person can carry.
Right, because being your own judge, your own jury, and your ultimate moral compass means you have to carry the entire weight of your existence every single day.
Yeah, there's no off day.
If you mess up, you have to find a way to forgive yourself, which is incredibly difficult. You can never just surrender. You can never say, God's got this, or it's in the universe's hands. You have to hold up the sky all by yourself.
And that profound exhaustion is perhaps the exact mechanism driving these post-atheistic movements to create such structured communities.
Oh, but share the load.
Exactly. They're attempting to distribute that massive existential weight by building shared tenets to guide each other, by engaging in collective charity, and by holding regular rituals to mark the passage of time. They are acknowledging a fundamental human limitation.
Wow.
They're recognizing that total isolated autonomy is an incredibly heavy burden for the human psyche to bear alone. They need a congregation, even if that congregation is fundamentally godless.
So let's bring this all together. Whether humanity is looking to an ancient sacred text for a divine framework, or staring into the cold laws of an indifferent universe, or mining the deep wells of their own human empathy, the search for meaning, for boundaries, and for true freedom is completely universal.
It's the core of the human experience.
We are all desperately trying to figure out how to live a good life, however we define it, and how to carry the weight of being alive.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked from these sources.
Let's hear it.
If that 1990s wave of atheism proved that human beings cannot survive in a purely logical, myth-free void, are we biologically destined to always invent a religion?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
Even if society successfully eliminates the concept of a supreme God entirely, will we inevitably just turn our own personal autonomy into a new deity, complete with its own strict rituals, its own unshakable symbols, and its own holy days?
It really makes you wonder. We swing the hammer and tear down the ancient cathedral because we reject the authority of the architect. But the moment the dust settles, we immediately use those exact same bricks to build a monument to the ultimate rebel. We just can't seem to escape the fundamental human need for a temple. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you next time.